the heavyweight champion of the world, James J. Braddock.
Braddock was a very ordinary guy. He was the kind of guy people could relate to. He was a man off the streets. He was a man like them. He was a man who fought the Depression.
James J. Braddock started out his career strong after making his debut in 1923.
Within 3 years, he established himself as a top-rated contender with victories over Jimmy Slattery and Tuffy Griffiths.
He fights his way into a title shot at 175 against Tommy Loughran.
Tommy Loughran was known as one of the supreme ring artists of his generation. Jim knew he would be a difficult opponent. He would have to fight, not box him.
Tommy Loughran was considered by many people to be perhaps the greatest light heavyweight who ever lived.
Braddock was considered a hitter, with more than half of his wins coming by KO. Loughran was not a puncher, but a pioneer of the jab and grab style of fighting.
Loughran's only 27 years old, but he's been fighting for 10 years. He's had 114 fights. He's won all but 6. He scored only 16 knockouts.
While Braddock did his best to pin down the slick and speedy champion, more often than not, he ran face first into an annoying jab and got tied up before he could fire much back.
Loughran decided to learn more about boxing. Since then, he's become the best. Loughran's never been knocked out, but he has been down twice. Braddock tries desperately, but the champion gives him a good boxing lesson. Braddock's making a fine showing tonight. He's won a lot of friends. If Loughran really retires, Braddock will have to be considered in line for the title, even if he loses this fight. It's over. Well, there's no doubt about the winner.
Braddock lost by decision. After the title fight, both Jimmy and the world hit hard times. 2 months later, the Dow Jones loses more than 12% of its value in a single day. The world went broke overnight. Brokers and bankers were hurling themselves from rooftops. The Great Depression was officially here.
25% of Americans were unemployed. And this is a huge number and had a devastating impact on people's lives.
Braddock went on a terrible skid. He was plagued by problems with his right hand. It got in a cycle of never quite healing completely and breaking just about every fight. He was a proud man with a work ethic and mouths to feed. He fought 7 times in 1930 and lost 4. The next 2 years got no better. He's going hungry so his kids can eat. Still on a terrible skid, the money from the fight game dries up, but the injuries remain. After shattering his hand again, he decides the juice isn't worth the squeeze when you're squeezing with a broken hand. Retires in 1933. He's taking temp jobs, working anywhere he can. The most reliable of this inconsistent work was hauling cargo down at the docks. His hand took months to heal, so most of his work was done with his left. But the worst injury comes to his pride, as he's reluctantly forced to take welfare so he can feed his family. Jim works lifting one-handed until he notices his right hand actually feels okay for once. Jim's been out of the game a year, struggling like everybody in the depths of the Great Depression. His manager, Joe Gould, shows up at the docks one day in need of a fighter. A heavyweight who can give some work to number 2 contender, Corn Griffin. It was a 5-rounder, scheduled for that weekend. Jim couldn't say no. Odds were 5-1 against him. That didn't matter in the face of feeding his kids. The $250 it paid was rent, heat, and food. He showed up to collect his check. He was landing hard punches, and his hand held up to the beating it was dishing out. Jim knocked him out in 3 rounds. For the first time in a long time, his stomach was full. The bills were paid. His wife was furious at first, but $250 was $250.
Well, I saw him fight once. That was only 1 round, and I ran out of the place screaming.
When he wins a unanimous decision over 6'4" Art Lasky, Braddock uses some of his purse to pay back the welfare he took in hard times. The press becomes enamored with his story and dubs the unlikely hero the Cinderella Man. Max Baer was the 5th champion in as many years. He was 6'3" and considered the hardest puncher of his era. He won the championship after knocking down giant Primo Carnera 11 times to take the title.
Exceptional first round for Max Baer. And look at this, it turns into a wrestling match. Max wants to take him out as quick as he can, and the big guy, as awkward as he is, just pulls him over. And Arthur Donovan may be stopping the fight. I think he has. We have a new world champion.
Max wasn't the bloodlusting animal they made him out to be, but it didn't change the fact that 2 men died shortly after fights with him. Max was looking for a soft touch to solidify his grasp on the title. Baer wanted Braddock, not just because he'd be a huge favorite in the actual fight. Braddock now had the media behind him. Any fight he was in would sell tickets, which looked like a win-win for the fledgling champion. Jim was listed as a 10-1 underdog. He trained like he was afraid for his life.
In that lion's den is Max Baer, and he's the lion that you have to go in and take the meat out of his mouth. Jimmy Braddock was facing one formidable mountain.
Braddock was getting off first, landing with a consistent jab. His feet carried him to safety. Max was having his moment inside. In terms of raw physical strength, he could ragdoll Braddock up close. The world waited for Baer to connect on one of those vicious overhands. While Baer was winding up and swinging wild, Braddock kept a jab in his face. And a shoulder between Baer's brick of a hand and his jaw. He was banking rounds, and his conditioning was holding up. Max is getting more tired and desperate. The 15th round finally comes and goes. Jim Braddock goes from begging for work on the dock in New Jersey to champion of the world in less than 2 years. First thing he does is jog over to shake Max's hand. That's where most tellings of this tale leave off. Not today. His next fight was far more important to history. He took on a very special contender. Joe Louis was the first black man to fight for a heavyweight championship in over 20 years. Jack Johnson was the first black heavyweight champion. After spending years as the colored heavyweight champ, Johnson wanted a shot at the true title. He was frozen out for years by the color line until he followed champion Tommy Burns around, taunting him. No venue in North America would hold such a contest, as it pretty much guaranteed a riot. The fight happened in Australia.
As Johnson moved in for the kill, the police stopped the fight to save Burns further humiliation and ordered the movie cameras to stop grinding.
When word got out in the U.S. Johnson had knocked Burns out to win the title, race riots flared up across the country. Dozens of people, most of them black, were victimized by roving mobs.
The minute he won that title, really unwelled a tremendous backlog of hate. This was the white man's crown.
His fight films were banned from being trafficked across state lines by Congress. Johnson deeply enjoyed pushing the buttons of the white establishment as champion. He married 3 white women in the time of Jim Crow. In 1912, the Mann Act is passed, which prevents trafficking of women across state lines for immoral purposes. The law would allow police to harass Johnson wherever he and his wife went. By the time he loses his title in 1915, he's left the U.S. after years of harassment, and the boxing establishment shuts its doors to the idea of another black contender for decades. That was until a brain trust of boxing insiders saw Joe Louis. He was born with a stutter. He worked hard to improve, but still, Joe preferred not to talk. He was given a code of conduct to follow, so he wouldn't run into the same issues Johnson did decades before. All he had to do was win, and win he did. Violently. And usually by KO. He fought 13 times in 1935. In June, took on the 6'6" former champion Primo Carnera. Joe got around the Giant's long jab and landed with crushing power. Carnera looked helpless, clinging to the ropes to remain on his feet. But Joe finished the Giant demolition job in 6. 3 months later, Joe would take on Max Baer. It was directly after Max lost the title to Braddock. It also happened to be the day Louis married his wife. Joe Louis had things to do and places to be. Joe Louis didn't need any extra incentive. He went after the former champion. It was barely a contest. Joe's speed and precise power was terrifying. The intimidating former champ fell in 4. Max said, quote, "I define fear as standing across the ring from Joe Louis, knowing he wants to go home early." Joe was named Athlete of the Year by the Associated Press and was the clear #1 contender.
Punching power is something to a large extent that cannot be taught. It can be strengthened. You can make a fair puncher into a good puncher. A great puncher like Lewis, they say, is born.
What gives you the belief that you can beat Joe Louis? The answer was always the same. He told everybody, I saw something.
Max Mailing!
When Joe pulled his jab back, it dropped to his chest, leaving him open to the cross counter over the top. It was a shock when the German former champion Max Schmeling upset and knocked out Lewis after dominating the whole fight. The Braddock camp was already deep into negotiations with Lewis when he lost to Schmeling. Joe Gould opted to continue negotiations with the Lewis camp rather than open talks with the Germans for political reasons. Gould also knew he had all the leverage in the world now. The deal he struck to give Lewis a title shot entitled Jim Braddock's camp to 10% of all Joe Louis fights for the next 10 years. It was worth every penny. Louis returned to form, taking tune-up fights and winning them brutally. Former champion Jack Sharkey had nothing for him and fell in 3 from a vicious short left.
Winner is Lewis!
A month later, he fought Al Ettore. Dropped him twice within 4 rounds. Before finishing him in the 5th. They met at Comiskey Park in Chicago.
For Black America, it was a milestone moment, and Joe Louis was at the center of it.
Something very unexpected happened. Joe Louis ran right into an uppercut from the Cinderella Man and took a seat. He was up before the count started. Jim Braddock fought his heart out. Both men were impeccably trained. Braddock worked his veteran savvy and high-volume style. Problem was, Joe Louis had every ounce of Baer's raw power. He also had the precision of a welterweight. Those wide overhands Baer attacked with came pin straight and just as powerful from Louis. His hooks came in far shorter and sharper with an order of magnitude less telegraph on them. And that made all the difference. The shots Braddock saw coming against Baer were an imperceptible shadow against Louis. Soon, you see that time is running out on the Cinderella Man. Joe was too quick, clean, and accurate. In the 8th, the finish came when Lewis lands a hook inside of Braddock's left arm, clearing out all his defense out of the way for one of the most lethal right hands in heavyweight history. The Cinderella story was over. The Joe Louis era had begun. Braddock said he could have laid on that canvas for 3 weeks.
And new champion of the world, Joe Louis.
Joe went on to hold the heavyweight championship for 12 years and become the first black athlete in America that people of every color cheered for, finally and formally desegregating the fight game and killing the color line. What were the odds of that?